Well, recently I've seen a number of articles where authors are trying to debate some of the ugliest classic cars ever produced. And I have to say that there are some picks on the list that I agree with, but a lot of them that I don't. So I thought that I would make my own list. Now, it's pretty hard to come up with a list of just 10 classic cars that I think are the ugliest, but I'm going to try to put on here some unconventional picks. Normally you see lists with things like the AMC Pacer that you see here, the AMC Gremlin, the AMC Matador. People love to pick on AMC. And you know what? I have to say, I don't think the Pacer that you see here is ugly. Maybe it's a little bit uglier after it got the raised hood to accommodate the V8 engine that was placed within the vehicle in the latter years. But I don't find the Pacer to be unattractive, nor necessarily the Matador Coupe, although the bumpers are pretty big. But that was true for any car in the mid-1970s. They all had large bumpers. There are some other vehicles, though, that I think, well, deserve to be on this list. And so that's what we're going to go through today, are some of the ugliest classic cars. And I'm not going to talk about more modern vehicles. There are some that people like to typically kind of put in the ugliest vehicles of all time on the modern car spectrum, cars like the Pontiac Aztek, etc. You know what? I'm going to leave that for another day. I actually think that in some ways the Pontiac Aztek was really a victim of circumstance. And it came out in a way that really nobody was all that happy, and it deserves a full story to be told about it. So let's get into our list of top 10 ugliest classic cars. And we'll start out with number 10, and that is the 1958 Lincoln and Continental. Now, bear in mind that Continental was still its own mark within the Ford Motor Company during this time frame through the 1959 model year, after which it would be sunset. It was introduced in 1956 along with the Continental Mark II, but it really fizzled shortly thereafter. Regardless, the 1958 Lincolns and Continentals were very strange sights, let's say, and certainly materially different than Cadillacs as well as Imperials. The kind of canted headlamps up front, the massive proportions. These cars were 131 inches in wheelbase, just enormous for the time, 229 inches in overall length. And the huge scalloped sections out of the body side in 1958 almost make the car look cartoonish. I don't know what else to call it. It looks like it's a cartoon, kind of a sketch that went straight into production, maybe not in a great sense, though. Now, one fact that attests to the fact that many people viewed these as relatively ugly cars is that they absolutely bombed in the marketplace. So much so that Lincoln was almost extinct. Robert S. McNamara, who was in charge at Ford at the time, was going to kill off Lincoln, and it really got saved by the 1961 Continental that came after the 1958 to 1960 variants. But that 1961 Continental, interestingly, was designed by the same people who did the 1958. So it just tells you a lot about design direction, and if you channel designers appropriately, they can really design beautiful vehicles. But for whatever reason, the 1958 Lincoln, to me, just came out looking very awkward. I have to say, though, in spite of that, I would love to own one. I think they are cool with their ugliness, if that makes any sense. And they had a wonderful 430 cubic inch MEL V8 underhood. This is where that kind of catchphrase Hot Rod Lincoln came from, was the MEL V8s. And the MEL V8 in 1958 would make the most horsepower. And then by 1960, because of Robert McNamara's decisions, it was forced to breathe through a two-barrel carburetor. And it was down to about 310 horsepower from 375, I believe, in 1958. So despite its size, it actually was a pretty peppy automobile for the 1958 model year. The other thing about the 1958 Lincolns that I have to say I do like is I do like the interiors and the theme. I love the dash with that kind of pod-like area, and the crazy HVAC control that you operate with just one knob that you just keep turning and twisting to activate heat or air conditioning if the cars were so equipped. By the way, these cars did have two air conditioning evaporators, one in either fender. So they did have highly effective air conditioning. And you pull that little knob out for the blower speed. So if that control ever fails, you're really just screwed from an HVAC perspective. But regardless, these 1958 Lincolns, I think, are just awesome pieces of machinery despite their relative ugliness. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have the 1958 Buick Limited. Now, in truth, it's a little bit tough to pick just one General Motors car from 1958 because there were a number of them that were, let's just say, less than handsome or beautiful. And I think the Buick and the Olds are probably my least favorite of the bunch, although the Buick, I want to say, kind of takes the cake. Both of them were festooned with so much chrome down the sides, way too much chrome. And you can see on the Limited, you have the strakes, you have spears, you have moldings, you have just about everything. And this huge grille up front, the so-called cufflink style grille, is just over the top. Now, the 1958 Buicks and the 1958 model lineup from General Motors was really the last of the Harley Earl era. Earl would retire after the 1958 model year, and Bill Mitchell would take up the vice presidency of General Motors styling. And interestingly, the 1959 model year vehicles from GM were supposed to kind of resemble the 1958s and be warmed over 58s. But when designers saw the 1957 model year Chryslers that were about to come out, the so-called four-wheeler Chryslers, they thought that their 1959 designs, remember, they're working 2 years in advance, 2 to 3 years in advance, were already just going to be sale-proof. And if you look at the 1958s like this Limited, they're kind of pudgy and doughy and puffy and tall, relatively high cowls and higher belt lines and higher roof lines, and just kind of a doughy form overall. And on top of that, they have so much chrome that, I mean, if the sun were shining and you were looking at the car, you'd probably be blinded by the reflection from the sun. And if you contrast that with the 1957 Chryslers, they have this very light, kind of airy look to them. These thin roof designs, they're lower, they're kind of wider in terms of their overall stance and look. It's that lower, longer, wider type proportion. And for that reason, I put the 1958 Limited on here because not only are the proportions pretty old by 1958, but just the amount of chrome that was added onto it was, let's call it, distasteful. In fact, one of the designers during this time frame at General Motors, Hank Haga, who would go on to later become the head of GM Opel Studio, as well as had a number of Chevrolet studios, commented that Harley Earl walked into the studios when these 1958s were being designed, and he said that he wanted more buzz bombs and hoop scoops and various things on the cars. And so the designers took all the different templates from the wall that they had made with various trim pieces and were putting them up on the vehicle just to see which ones might work. And Harley Earl walked in and basically told him he wanted all of them on the car. And that's how you get a car like the 1958 Limited, which I think is a pretty homely car. Not a bad car to drive, but just a not great looking car, and that's why it's number 9 on this list. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have the 1974 Ford Gran Torino Elite. Now, this car would later become known as just the Elite, but for its inaugural model year in 1974, it was known by that full name, the Gran Torino Elite, to kind of connote that it was the top-of-the-line Torino. And really what Ford was trying to do with this particular vehicle was have its own response to Chevrolet's very successful Monte Carlo that came out in 1970. And then the Monte Carlo would be introduced, the second version of the Monte Carlo would be introduced in 1973. And it was highly successful. Interestingly, that Monte Carlo was really a response to Pontiac's 1969 Grand Prix and the personal luxury coupe craze that had been kicked off all the way back with the 1958 Thunderbird. So Ford really was the one who started the personal luxury coupe craze. Then General Motors, I would say, really leaned into it with the cars like the 1963 Riviera, as well as the 1969 Grand Prix. And then the Monte Carlo in 1970. Remember, John DeLorean was the general manager of Pontiac and was responsible really for the 1969 Grand Prix. And then when he came to Chevrolet as the general manager, he wanted something similar and then pushed the Monte Carlo into production. Well, Ford had to have its own personal luxury coupe, and it was this, I hesitate to call it beautiful or anything, any similar adjective that has beauty in it, because this, to my eye, this Gran Torino Elite is just awful. The single headlamps on either side, the huge bumper, which, yes, all cars had in 1974 because of the bumper impact standards, but Ford just seemed to integrate them the worst of all of the big three. This extra toothy kind of texture within a textured grille, the belt line that's got this dramatic upsweep to it, near the rear quarter window, the kind of dated Coke bottle-y styled rear where the sheet metal flares outboard around the rear wheel and then upward with the window graphic there. Oh, it's just atrocious in that I can't really call it an opera window. Maybe it's a double opera window on this car. It just does not look right. These overhangs look too long, probably because of the bumpers in part. And the styling just looks tired and dated, even by 1974 standards. And, you know, I have to say, it didn't sell horribly, but this car I don't think was a home run necessarily either. It was a quick kind of way for Ford to get a response to the Monte Carlo, which, by the way, the Monte Carlo, the first generation, was also a rush job too, and shared a lot of components with other A-body vehicles from General Motors. But this Gran Torino Elite, as it was known for 1974, to me, I just can't get over the styling. And even the interior is just kind of, I don't know, dated and uninteresting. Now, there's going to be some Ford lovers out there who are going to just come after me for saying things like this, and people who love the Gran Torino Elite, but that's okay. I can take it. It just is not one of my favorite cars from Ford in the Gene Bourdonnais era. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the 1977 Lincoln Versailles. Now, for 1977, Lincoln would introduce a vehicle that it would really try to copy, again, a General Motors successful vehicle, the 1976 to 1979 Cadillac Seville, which was a home run from the perspective that it was Cadillac's smallest vehicle and its most expensive. And it sold very well. Customers loved it. It was the so-called internationally sized Cadillac, and it really was based upon a Nova chassis that Cadillac had stretched the wheelbase by 3 inches. And I will say did extensive work on the chassis to make sure that the car drove relatively well. And if you drive one of these 76 to 79 Sevilles, they actually are pretty pleasant cars to drive. So for 1977, Lincoln decided to copy a similar formula and took the Ford Granada, Mercury Monarch, and decided that it was going to dress it up as the Lincoln Versailles. And the Versailles never achieved the same level of success that the Cadillac Seville did. I think because the Seville really introduced a so-called new sheer look style, that 3-box design with very clean, crisp edges. And that car still looks timeless today, the 76 to 79 Seville, especially if you get one without a vinyl roof. Unfortunately, the Lincoln Versailles was kind of a flop in the marketplace, and it was gone after the 1980 model year, whereas the Cadillac Seville nameplate lived on for many years after the first generation car. And I think part of that was the Versailles just had kind of this dumpy, old styling associated with it, often seen with these vinyl roofs and half vinyl roofs and very flat fenders, flat quarter profile. The 77 and 78 model years really had a shared roof line with the Granada that wasn't disguised. The latter model years, the 79 and 80, had a more formal roof line, and I believe that was done through the use of a fiberglass cap on the back. So they had to have that half vinyl toupee, if you will, on the cars, and they just look ill-proportioned and unfortunate. Now, that isn't to say that the Versailles was actually a bad car. In fact, if you drive one, they drive pretty gosh darn nicely. Ford did spend a lot of money upgrading the chassis from the Granada to make sure that it was something that was befitting of a Lincoln. And they had even double isolated front suspension components, and it really was something that Ford invested a lot of time and capital into, well, relatively, I would say, to make the car drive like a more premium automobile. In fact, one of the greatest things about the Versailles is that they came with disc brakes in the rear, and so a lot of hot rodders loved the rear ends in the Versailles for that reason. But overall, the car, from a styling perspective, inside and out, just looked dated and tired by 1977, 1978. The interior in particular looked overstuffed, and it just looks like the seats are puffy, the door panels are puffy, the IP is puffy, and you got the fake wood. Ford used to do really good, convincingly fake wood grain particularly on the Mark III when it came out in 1969. But by this point, I don't know what happened. The fake wood grain just wasn't quite the same on the inside either. And so for those reasons, despite being actually a pretty pleasant car to drive, the Lincoln Versailles makes this list. Now let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. The Mercury Turnpike Cruiser was produced for 1957 and 1958. And I have to say the 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser is one of the oddest looking vehicles of the 50s or of any generation. You've got this super toothy grille that's divided into 3 sections, the turn signals over the headlamps, the antennas that are pointing forward on the car. I mean, the front end just looks like a Martian has landed on Earth as a car. And I think the other interesting thing about this is I believe Gene Bourdonnais was one of the leaders of the styling department for the Lincoln Mercury division during this time. And despite the fact that this car didn't sell well, was super quirky looking, Gene Bourdonnais was the one who would end up getting the design vice presidency at Ford Motor Company over Elwood Engel when George Walker would retire. And Bourdonnais would lead Ford styling for many years, the last cars that he did being the first generation Panther platform vehicles, the Lincoln Mark VI. And I would say Bourdonnais had a number of hits and misses. He loved, in the latter years, these very flat fenders and quarters like you saw on the Lincoln Versailles. But in 1957, I guess he just loved quirkiness because I don't know how else to describe the Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. Now, the other unfortunate thing about the Mercury Turnpike Cruiser was that in its inaugural model year, 1957, it really didn't have a great engine under hood. It had a 390 horsepower, 368 cubic inch V8, and that kind of christened it the Turnpike Loser on the streets because it didn't have any pep. For 58, Ford really did rectify that, and you could get up to a 400 horsepower, 430 cubic inch MEL V8 under hood. That was, I believe, the first domestic car to crack 400 gross horsepower was actually the Mercury Turnpike Cruiser. So Ford took a year, but they finally did put appropriate power behind the Turnpike Cruiser in its second model year. But I think the damage was done, and they shouldn't have called it a Turnpike Cruiser if they weren't going to put the power under the hood to begin with. But oh my goodness, what quirky looking styling, especially those forward-facing antennas. That's why it's on the list. Let's move on. And now we hit number 5, getting into the fun ones. We have the 1990 Imperial. Now, Imperial was its own standalone mark for Chrysler for many years, all the way until the 1974 model year. After that, it would go on a brief hiatus before coming back in 1981, and the Bustleback Imperial would last through 1983. But then in 1990, Chrysler would resurrect the Imperial name and put it on a K car with an extended wheelbase, almost 109 inches, and put it on this homely-looking car. Unfortunately, the K car-based Imperial was everything that Lee Iacocca loved, and I think the buying public was really eschewing at this point. He loved that kind of waterfall Grecian temple-style grille up front that you can see, the flat belt line, the very formal style C-pillar that really harkened back to the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville. That's really where Chrysler got that design cue from and the popularity. The half vinyl toupe, or the interior was even just not great. Very angular and boxy. It's one of those cars that you think that the designers really wanted to have square wheels so that it would fit the overall design. Now, the interesting thing about the Imperial was that it actually was designed by the same people who would do the first generation LH cars, which were frankly beautiful vehicles. Maybe not the best in terms of build quality, but certainly gorgeous cars like the Intrepid or the Eagle Vision, the Chrysler LHS, etc. But this Imperial that would last all the way through to the 1993 model year was just an anachronism. It had so much that harkened back to the past that it almost was offensive, between that vinyl roof and that waterfall-style grille, or I shouldn't call it necessarily waterfall, but the upright vertical bars, just kind of chunky moldings, full wire wheel covers. It was everything that kind of spoke to the past in terms of design. And That's why the 1990 Imperial makes the list. And at number 4, we will continue with the Chrysler vehicles in the stable and talk about the 1961 Dodge Lancer. Now, in 1960, Chrysler would launch the Valiant. It was not the Plymouth Valiant. It was actually just the Valiant for 1960. And it was a small car that was, let's just call it, interestingly styled from Plymouth. This was the waning years of Virgil Exner's design career at Chrysler. He would be fired in 1962, and Elwood Engel would get the top job. And that was presumably after the disastrous sales that Chrysler's had in the 1961 model year and kind of throughout the early 1960s. It seems like Exner really hit it out of the park with the 1957 forward-look Chryslers, but just couldn't replicate that success. He would blame some of that on the corporate management's decision to downsize the platforms and vehicles, particularly for Plymouth, and they really didn't have a full-size car in 1962 when they introduced the new cars. But really the styling that he came up with was quite controversial during this time frame as well. And while one could pick on the little Valiant for 1960, I actually think the Lancer is a bit more offensive. Of course, Dodge dealers, once the Plymouth dealers got the Valiant to sell, they were jealous, and they wanted something to sell in the small car field. And they got the Lancer for 1961, one model year after the Valiant. Now, the Lancer, I think, has even more sculptural body sides and a funnier-looking front end than the Valiant, with just a lot going on, and awkward proportions and just a strange-looking car. I mean, if you were looking for a small car during this time frame, I don't think that what you were really looking for was something to stand out in this way. This was not a stylish car, I don't think. It was something that was certainly different, but if you want to be different, just cut your nose off your face and stare at people, and you'll be different then, but that's not necessarily a great thing. In any case, the Dodge Lancer was a car that didn't prove overly successful for the Dodge dealers, but it was something to complement their portfolio, and at the opposite end of the spectrum from the full-size 880, which was a rush job that Dodge put into production after it decided that it wasn't a great idea to not have a large car, and the overall Chrysler portfolio during this time frame was pretty challenged, and you may, in short order, see something else on the list from Chrysler. Let's move on to the next one. And now we'll hop over to Ford for number 3. And at number 3, we have the Lincoln Mark 6. Now, the Lincoln Mark 6 was introduced for the 1980 model year. We'll continue on to the 1983 model year, and this would be the first time that a Mark series could be had, at least I'll call it the modern Mark series, after the Mark III's introduction in 1969, in four-door form. And the Mark VI, to me, it just looks like designers tried to take a Mark V and put it on a smaller package, which is really what it was. It was a much shorter package than the Mark V. But whereas the Mark V certainly had a presence, and I think the proportions worked, although that equal front and rear overhang looks a little bit dated, certainly by today's standards, the Mark VI, to my eye, just didn't work. And I have to say that aside from the overall proportions, the car even got flatter with respect to the fenders and the quarters, and even more boxy, particularly the four-door variant, than any of the Marks before it. And it's really hard to kind of say that the Mark VI was an adequate successor to the Mark III or the Mark IV. The Mark IV in particular was a beautiful car, the 1972 Mark IV. But this Mark VI just looks like it was designed with a ruler and a T-square and no sweeps, no curves, no nothing. It just, it's one of the worst of the Gene Bourdonnais era to my mind. Now, of course, the Mark VI and the Thunderbird were introduced, the Boxbird were introduced in the same year, 1980. And the Boxbird also was one that I think is the worst looking of all the Thunderbirds. And it preceded the beautiful Aero Coupe Thunderbird that came out in 1983. And of course, the Mark VI preceded the beautiful Mark VII that would come out in 1984. So Ford would really move forward from a design standpoint in the generation after this. And that's because there was a whole new design team and design leadership at Ford. Gene Bourdonnais was out, Jack Telnack and the team were in, and they really pioneered this aero look that went up and down the lineup, starting with the Thunderbird. There was the Tempo and the Topaz, and then, of course, the 1986 Ford Taurus and Sable. And that really put Ford at the forefront of design in the 1980s, to be honest. But back during this time frame, before those cars came out, there was the Lincoln Mark VI. And like I said, I don't know about others, but to my eye, the Mark VI is just one of the worst-looking cars that Ford produced. And I know that some of the Ford lovers are going to hate me for saying that. And some of them, just the Fords of this era didn't necessarily drive that well either, because they had the wonderful variable Venturi carburetors, which thankfully you could replace very easily with an old school Autolite 2100 two-barrel. But, oh well, there we go. And they also had, during this time frame, the AOD transmissions, which if you jammed on the brakes and locked the rear wheels while the transmission was in lockup, it would stall the engine. Ford had to recall those. So a lot of issues during this time frame with Ford cars, and they also didn't look all that great. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have the 1961 Plymouths, back to the Mopars. So somebody's going to think I'm going to pick on Mopars because our final 2 vehicles are going to be Mopars, and maybe we should invert the order of these, but this is just personal preference. The 1961 Plymouths, I do not know what Virgil Exner was thinking with these fenders that kind of sweep in and create this loop on the front of the front end of the car, or I guess semi-loop. It does look a little bit Lexus-like, modern-day Lexus-like. Maybe that exonerates Virgil Exner, but the 1961 Plymouths were just absolute bombs in the market. This was the last model year before Plymouth would revise and shrink their lineup so that the largest cars were really almost mid-size vehicles. And these cars, to my mind, look so dated, so comical. It's amazing that Virgil Exner and his team, the group that really put Chrysler on the map for styling and propelled Plymouth back to the number 3 position in the marketplace in 1957 with its vehicles, would design something like the 1961s. They look actually like they were a regression from the 1957 model year vehicles. But this is what they decided to introduce. At least there weren't these tall fins in the back anymore. There was now a more muted kind of horizontal orientation to the back. But the 61 Plymouths were something that the buying public just never got acclimated to. And I think Chrysler was also still reeling during this time frame from the 1957 cars that were beautiful, but had a number of quality issues, and they rusted very early, and it really hampered Chrysler and Plymouth division's reputation all the way through the early 1960s, and it was further debased when Plymouth didn't have a full-size car for the 1962 model year to compete with Ford and Chevrolets, because Chrysler management thought that GM was not going to offer a similarly large car from Chevrolet. In any case, the 61 Plymouths, I just think, they're over the top, tired and dated by the time frame. I mean, again, GM and even Ford, think about Ford, what it was producing in 1961. Cars like the Continental, and then contrast that Continental, which is admittedly an upper-end luxury car, but it certainly connotes the direction of styling, versus the 61 Plymouth. It's just night and day. Even a car like the 1960 Ford, the model year before the 61 Plymouth, I think it's a beautiful vehicle. The 61 Plymouth just is not that. Let's move on to number 1. And at number 1, we have a Mopar, the 1977 LeBaron, Chrysler LeBaron, I will call it, as opposed to the LeBaron. And I'll probably pick on the LeBaron Coupe in particular because I think it's the most homely of the two, as opposed to the four-door. Although the four-door is also pretty bad, I'll strike that. Let's just pick on both of them. So for 1977, Chrysler would introduce this new downsized LeBaron that would be based on the M body. And there's so much that I have to say about this. The front end of the car with the headlamps and the turn signals above the headlamps, it just looks humorous. The side profile of the car with the kind of check in the belt line there, the Monte Carlo-esque rear quarter panel with the chicken wing on it. The car just looks like a mix and a hodgepodge of a bunch of different vehicles, and it never really comes together. The rear end with kind of this, I don't know, I want to call it almost a boat tail point, a cliched and perhaps overused styling theme from General Motors here was not executed all that well either. And then beyond that, these cars were pretty miserable from a quality standpoint as well as behind the wheel. The cars had a lot of stalling issues with the lean bird setup under hood. They were based on a similar platform, not the exact same, but a similar platform to the Aspen Volare, which were the most recalled cars to date when they were introduced. They did have the transverse mounted torsion bars up front with a relatively stiff suspension, leaf spring rear. Some people like that. I actually don't mind it, but it is definitely a stiff ride. And then I have to say on the four doors, the thing that takes it over the top is some of the models that have the vinyl covering on the belt line. I just have no words. I have no words for the styling of this car. I think it's homely, it's hideous, and it's really unfortunate. Chrysler was still making some good-looking cars during this time frame. I actually think that the 1977 New Yorker Brougham, which was effectively a 74 Imperial, was still a good-looking car, at least in the four-door form. But this car was anything but. I actually even preferred the R-body Chryslers that would come out shortly thereafter that would be very short-lived. But this kickoff to the M-bodies was something that just was hideous and not fun to drive and had a lot of quality issues. They just were not good cars, unfortunately. So for that reason, that tops out this list at number 1. What do you think? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know. Thanks again for watching.